Champions of the 1970s, titans in the music industry, and kings of disco. They've pioneered the music industry and created classic hits with their love for songmaking. From their struggle to stardom, their peak during the era of disco, and the fateful night that disco unexpectedly died. This is the tragedy of the Bee Gees. The trio of brothers, Barry Gibb, and the twins, Robin and Maurice Gibb, began performing music in England during the 1940s. They would sing for fun as kids before they discovered that they had true talent when performing at a cinema. They would go on to perform shows on street corners and clubs as a result, gaining popularity before moving to Brisbane, Australia with their family. They often performed at a racetrack nearby where an impressed race car driver, Bill Good, would connect them to a DJ from Sydney, Bill Gates, becoming their promoter and enabling them to branch out to new places to perform. With Barry Gibb, Bill Good, and Bill Gates, the brothers would finally name themselves to those initials, the Bee Gees, expanding into the Bee Gees. Bill Gates would eventually quit as their promoter as he struggled to advance their careers. Their father, Heyoo Gibb, would take over instead, refusing to let their talents go to waste by acting as their manager and chauffeur. The Bee Gees would slowly progress their careers in the music industry, but it ultimately wasn't enough as they hadn't succeeded as much as they had hoped. Their father had sent some tapings that would find their way over to Robert Stigwood, a music producer and manager, signing a contract with the Bee Gees to start on their first international album right away. Stigwood would send their next single with a blank label to radio stations. These stations assumed that this mystery single was by the Beatles with such strong similarities between them, resulting in the single being played over and over, creating much success.
It's just a photograph of someone that I knew. Have you seen my wife, Mr. Jones? Do you know what it's like?
With the success of their first international album, Bee Gees First, they continued with their success by appearing on TV shows and releasing more singles than albums. Their success has grown so much to this point that they began having Beatles-like reception with fans and public. The Bee Gees were just about to depart for a US tour and record their sixth album afterwards. However, with the immense amount of work the group had been putting in, Robin collapsed and went unconscious, suffering from nervous exhaustion. Robin had been struggling with crippling low self-esteem, beginning to feel that their manager, Stigwood, was favoring Barry as the frontman of the group, causing Robin to pursue a solo career, while Barry and Maurice went on to continue working together as the Bee Gees, inviting their Gibb sister, Leslie, as a replacement for Robin. The Bee Gees was now essentially in shambles, broken apart with constant arguments, drinking, and drug abuse. Maurice and Barry would also eventually go on their separate ways and record their own solo albums that would never be released. Robin, on the other hand, was seeing success with his #2 single, Saved by the Bell, and album, Robin's Reign. Yet, despite all the signs pointing to the group being finished with all the brothers seemingly pursuing a solo career, Robin would call up Barry saying, "Let's do it again." In June of 1970, the Bee Gees would reunite with just the three brothers again, announcing that they are there and they will never ever part again, releasing their 9th album and many more singles. But a mere 4 years later, they would struggle to find success after selling poorly on their 10th album and several other singles and compilation albums. They eventually found themselves working in small clubs. The music they were making simply wasn't working anymore, from soul to R&B. But at the same time, the genre of disco was starting to emerge into the industry and the world. The Bee Gees would begin producing dance-oriented disco songs such as Jive Talking. As the public enjoyed this new sound, the Bee Gees themselves enjoyed it as well, with Barry developing his use of falsetto, an eventual trademark of the band. They found themselves working on the soundtrack for a movie, Saturday Night Fever, starring John Travolta, halting the album they were working on at the time, and reusing some of those tracks, such as Staying Alive and More Than a Woman, for the film instead. The Bee Gees would write the soundtrack in a single weekend. The soundtrack would be a turning point for their career, as both the film and the soundtrack would culturally be influential and impactful on a degree never seen before, prolonging the mainstream appeal of disco just a little while longer. Just as they were beginning to ride the peak of their careers, it would all come crashing down on one fateful night. An event called the Disco Demolition would be held during a baseball game, hosted by a few DJs who had grown sick and tired of disco, especially as it came to replace the sounds of rock and roll. The event would blow up a dumpster full of disco records brought in by the audience themselves. What they expected to be a crowd of 20,000 people turned out to be a crowd of well over 40,000. They failed to collect the records from the crowd, who would later use it as dangerous projectiles by throwing them as frisbees. Following the anticipated explosion, the crowd jumped from their seats and onto the field itself, wreaking havoc as they tore down equipment, set bonfires, cars and have fistfights. The event, broadcasted on television, led to 9 injuries and 39 arrests. Horrified by the events of the Disco Demolition and afraid of public backlash, American radio had virtually banned disco. Despite Barry's condonement of the radio silence, calling it evil and censorship, it no longer mattered. The Bee Gees went from kings of disco to the butt of many jokes, especially those centered around homophobia with their exposed chest hairs and high voices. The Bee Gees would never be the same again, with Maurice taking it the worst of all, battling his addiction with alcohol and drugs yet again. They would abandon their classic disco sound as a result of all the backlash, releasing their next album, which would become a commercial failure as the Bee Gees were so strongly known for disco. On top of that, they were overshadowed by Robin's complications with his estranged wife, breaking into her home and getting arrested trying to collect evidence as he was convinced she was having an affair with her divorce lawyer. Realizing the reality of their situation, Barry convinced the brothers to take a backseat in the music industry, producing for other artists instead of being in the limelight. They would help produce #1 hits for the likes of Barbra Streisand, Dolly Parton, and Dionne Warwick. But the success of these artists would only further depress Maurice, as he believed he and his brothers could have had the success for themselves. The brothers went on their own separate ways for a while, releasing their own singles and albums. They would eventually come back together 6 years later, releasing a new album, and would continue to do so while reaching levels of success, albeit not quite the same as during their peak in disco. However, over the years, the brothers would face health issues that would become detrimental to their future in the music industry. Barry began developing back problems and arthritis. His arthritis became so painful he doubted he could play guitar for much longer. Determined to have one last live performance before his health held him back permanently, the brothers held a show, one night only, in Las Vegas. With the enormous success of the show, Barry persevered through his pain and instead extended the one-night show into a world tour. Years later, his brothers would also come to suffer complications from their health as well. On January 12, 2003, at the age of 53, Maurice Gibb passed unexpectedly to a heart attack. While the remaining brothers, Barry and Robin, announced that they would continue the Bee Gees name in his memory, they eventually decided to retire the name as it was supposed to represent the 3 brothers together. 9 years later, Robin Gibb would be diagnosed with liver cancer and contracted pneumonia, forcing him into a coma. Although he would eventually wake up, his condition only continued to deteriorate, resulting in liver and kidney failure, passing away on May 20th, 2012 at the age of 61. All that remains is Barry Gibb, the eldest of the brothers. Switching to country music, he has continued to make music in the memory of his brothers and as his form of therapy. He notes that no matter how much he missed them, he needed to stay active. He lives with a regret that whenever his brothers had passed, they weren't on the best of terms. The Bee Gees were no doubt titans in the music industry. The Bee Gees have shaped a decade's worth of music as the pioneers and champions of disco. Despite the explosive end of the disco's lifetime, the Bee Gees persevered through their hardships and still continued to make music out of passion and love. Some of their most iconic hits are still recognized and appreciated around the world, from Staying Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, and Night Fever. This is the legacy of the Bee Gees.
Only words, and words are all I have to take your heart away.